November 16th, 1982, a Chevy Blazer was found in the middle of the desolate Wyoming prairie. Its doors were open, the engine was running, and clothes were strewn all over the highway. Its 35-year-old owner, Donkemp, was nowhere in sight. 4 years after he disappeared, Don's body was found just a few miles from where his Blazer had been abandoned. The sheriff concluded that Don had frozen to death in a blizzard 3 days after he was lost. Don's family is not convinced.
My son was murdered. I definitely believe this. Absolutely. He was murdered.
Mary Kemp has conducted her own investigation into her son's death and has turned up some disturbing evidence. She now believes that Don did not become lost in the wilderness, but that he was abducted, taken away from the area, and killed. The local sheriff is sure that Don died of natural causes. However, the mounting evidence, including a series of telephone calls made by Don 5 months after he supposedly died, demands a second look at this case. Don was a promising young advertising executive in New York City until he was severely disabled in a traffic accident. It took him 3 years to recover, and he lost all desire to return to Madison Avenue.
He had become disillusioned a bit with materialism. Don loved the good life, you know, and New York was the epitome of that. And I think he wanted a simpler time and a quieter time, and I think that's what drew him to that area.
In September 1982, Don sold almost everything he owned, bought a Chevy Blazer, and began a long drive west. His destination was Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where he intended to write a book about Abraham Lincoln's assassination. The day before he disappeared, Don was seen at a Western museum in Cheyenne. He wandered through the small galleries for 2 hours, speaking to no one. When he left, Don apparently forgot his attaché case. In it were his traveler's checks, diaries, and his driving glasses.
We were mystified why this attaché was left there. They told us at the museum that he had called and said, "Is my attaché there?" And they said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "I'll be in for it right away," and he never came in.
The next day at 10 a.m., 2 highway patrolmen found Don's Blazer. It had been there since 7:30 that morning.
Neither of us has seen anything like this. The vehicle was left 40 miles from any town on an off-ramp, running, stuff strung out of it, the doors open, a relatively new vehicle, not one that someone would just leave. Run a 28, 29 on it, Mike, and see if it's not stolen. We think he was alone because there was only room for one person in the vehicle. It was so full of camping gear and papers and briefcases and suitcases that I don't know how you could get another person in the vehicle.
At the time the car was found, there was patchy snow on the ground. A single set of footprints led from the roadside into the empty prairie.
I have no idea what would inspire anybody to walk out through that prairie in the middle of winter. We considered possibly someone under medication that didn't know what they were doing due to the medication or being out of the medication. Possibly that would affect them to the point of where they would just walk out into the middle of nowhere.
The local sheriff's department concluded that Don wandered off alone. Don's mother believes he was abducted and taken from the area.
I was certain he was in a horrible jam. I just felt it because this was so unlike my son. I knew that he hadn't walked out there. I feel that he didn't. And yet the sheriff kept saying that he was out there.
Well, I think he was mentally disturbed. He was having problems, mental problems, and possibly some health problems, and he just couldn't cope with it.
Sheriff Ogburn sent a plane to search for Don, assuming he was a missing person, not the victim of a crime. Deputy Rod Johnson flew over the area for 2 hours. He could see for miles in open terrain, but there was no trace of Don.
I felt the guy was disorientated, and I felt that he didn't want to be found. If he would have wanted to be found, he would have heard the aircraft, could have came up, waved his arms, got attention, gone up to a ridge, anywhere, and been sighted.
Later that day, Johnson joined 2 other deputies in a ground search. A mile from the highway, they found a duffel bag lying near the single set of tracks. In it were laundry soap, clothes, and a teapot, all belonging to Don.
I believe they were put there to make out that to look like my son had walked out there. And I don't believe my son did.
On the second day of the search, tracks in the snow led Rod Johnson to a barn 6 miles from the highway. Inside, the only sign of life was a pile of sticks, arranged as if someone had tried to start a fire, and 3 socks.
The 3 socks that were found in the barn were Donnie's socks. I have no idea how they got there. I think they were put there by someone other than my son.
There was a snowdrift completely around the barn and no tracks leading away from it. I looked closer at the snowdrift and discovered that somebody had turned around and stepped backwards and walked backwards, stepping in their same tracks to try to hide their trail coming into the barn. And it just seemed like someone was trying to hide from us.
3 days after he disappeared, a blizzard made it impossible to continue the search, and many believe Don died in the storm. 3 years later, a group of hunters discovered Don's remains a few miles from where his Blazer had been abandoned.
Oh, yeah, that's human, all right.
An autopsy showed no signs of a struggle.
We never did suspect foul play. He was out there and was avoiding us, stayed away from us, and I believe on the second or third day he was going to try to get back to his vehicle. He seen he was in trouble, and he didn't make it.
This should have been where the case ended, but Mary Kemp continues to be haunted by a string of unanswered questions. 5 months after Don supposedly died in the blizzard, he was sighted in Casper, Wyoming on 2 occasions. In one, he was seen at a traveling exhibit of Abraham Lincoln memorabilia. In the second, Mary Kemp talked to a bartender who distinctly remembers serving Don. Even more baffling, at the same time as these sightings, one of Don's closest friends returned home from vacation to find 6 different telephone messages from Don on her answering machine. Like Mary, she believes Don was murdered. Fearful of her own safety, she does not want to be identified.
I'm absolutely certain that it was his voice. And it was a very brief message. I'd like to speak to you again. Call me and a phone number. The next day, I called, asked to speak to Don. A man answered the phone. He said that Don was out. I'm convinced he holds the clue to what really happened to Don.
Telephone records show that the calls were made 180 miles from where Don disappeared, from a trailer in Casper, Wyoming. The young man who was renting the trailer at the time claimed that the phone company had made a mistake.
He told us in all occasions and all interviews that he had no knowledge of the phone calls and that he had not made the phone calls. I had an occasion to show him a picture of Donald Kemp, and he said that he did not know Donald Kemp, had never seen Donald Kemp, and knew nothing of his whereabouts.
Not satisfied with the young man's story, Mary Kemp went to Casper to conduct her own investigation.
What we saw on that phone bill was horrible. There were sex calls to sex parlors all over the United States. God knows what happened to my son in that trailer. It's too horrible to contemplate. I don't know. I don't know. But I think I deserve an answer. I tried in every way I knew how to contact this young man. I finally spoke with him only one time on the phone, and I asked him about my son. And he said he knew nothing about Donkemp. He knew nothing about Donkemp. He just paid those phone bills. He didn't look at them. And I told this young man he was lying. You know what has happened to my son. And he just hung up on me.
3 weeks after he was questioned, the young man moved out of the trailer and left Casper.
And all 3 times that I spoke with him, he was always very cooperative. and I have no reason to feel that the individual here in Casper had any knowledge of this man's even being in Wyoming other than these phone calls. And I don't have an explanation for it, nor did he.
Who made the phone calls? That's the big question. Who it was had to have been my son.
Something happened to Donkemp in the vast Wyoming prairie. Sheriff Ogburn thinks he died in a blizzard, but can't explain the phone calls. Mary believes Don was abducted and taken to Casper. But then why was his body found just 3 miles from his abandoned blazer?
I hope this story will bring somebody who can tell me exactly what happened to my son. Because I know there are people who know what happened to my son. I know this.